Before the sun rose over the land of Uz, before the gates opened and the fields stirred beneath the pale morning sky, there was a man whose life seemed unshakable. His name was Job. He was known as a righteous man, a man of integrity, a man whose house was full, whose table was never empty, whose children laughed beneath the protection of his name, and whose wealth stretched farther than the eye could count. And then, in a single day, everything changed, not slowly, not gradually, not with time to prepare his heart. One messenger came running, then another, then another, then another. By the time the sun moved across the sky, the man who had awakened with flocks, servants, children, honor, peace, and a future was sitting in the ruins of a life he could no longer recognize. His wealth was gone. His servants were gone. His children were gone. His body would soon be covered in pain. His friends would not understand him. His wife would look at him through the wreckage of their home and speak from the depths of her own grief. And Job, the man who had done nothing to deserve such destruction, would be left with the question that has echoed through every generation since. Why do the righteous suffer? It is easy to speak about faith when the house is standing, when the harvest is full, when the family is safe, when prayers seem to rise and blessings seem to fall in answer. But what happens when the house collapses? What happens when heaven feels silent? What happens when the one who feared God loses everything and still receives no explanation? Job's story is not only an ancient account from a distant land. It is the story of every soul that has ever stood beside a grave, sat in a silent room, received the news that changed everything, or lifted tear-filled eyes toward heaven and asked, "Why?" In the land of Uz, there lived a man whose name was Job. He was blameless and upright, a man who feared God and turned away from evil. These were not empty words spoken after his life was gone. They described the way he lived while the world could still see him. His faith was not a performance. It was woven into his mornings, into his decisions, into the way he governed his household, into the way he treated his servants, and into the way he carried wealth without letting wealth possess him. Job was not a poor man hidden in obscurity. He was great among the people of the East. His wealth was measured in animals, land, servants, and influence. He had thousands of sheep, camels, oxen, and donkeys. In that ancient world, such numbers were not merely signs of comfort. They were signs of strength, security, and legacy. The roads near his estate would have known the movement of herds. The fields would have carried the sound of labor. Servants would have moved between tents and storehouses. The bleating of sheep, the lowing of oxen, the heavy steps of camels, the voices of workers calling to one another beneath the heat of the day, all of it formed the rhythm of a life that seemed deeply rooted. But Job's greatest treasure was not in the fields. He had 7 sons and 3 daughters. In their houses there was feasting. His sons would gather each in his own turn, inviting their sisters to eat and drink with them. It was a picture of closeness, prosperity, and family joy. Their laughter must have carried through the rooms. Their tables must have been filled with bread, wine, conversation, and the careless ease that often belongs to those who have never imagined how fragile a single day can be. And Job, though a father of grown children, still watched over their souls. When the days of feasting had run their course, Job would rise early in the morning and offer burnt offerings for each of them. He said in his heart, "It may be that my children have sinned and cursed God in their hearts." This was the heart of Job. He did not only care about what could be seen, he cared about what might be hidden. He understood that prosperity could make the soul forgetful. He knew that joy, even innocent joy, needed to be held before God. And so, before the day belonged to business, before others came seeking his judgment or his help, Job stood as a father before the Lord, interceding for the children he loved. His life was peaceful, but it was not careless. His wealth was great, but his reverence was greater. And perhaps that is what makes the coming darkness so difficult to understand. Because when people suffer, others often search their lives for reasons. They ask, what must have gone wrong? What hidden sin must have opened the door? What mistake must have caused the collapse? The human mind struggles to accept pain without explanation. It wants a ledger. It wants a formula. It wants the world to be simple. Good people prosper. Bad people fall. But Job's story begins by removing that easy answer. Job was not suffering because he was wicked. He was not a hypocrite exposed by judgment. He was not a man whose secret life finally caught up with him. He was blameless and upright. And still, suffering came. There are moments in Scripture when the curtain is pulled back and we are allowed to see what the person living the story cannot see. Job did not know what was happening beyond the visible world. He did not know that his name had been spoken in a heavenly council. He did not know that the integrity of his faith had become the center of a great and terrible test. The Lord said of Job, "There is none like him on the earth, a blameless and upright man who fears God and turns away from evil." But the adversary questioned Job's devotion. Does Job fear God for nothing? The accusation was sharp. It suggested that Job's faith was not love, but transaction, not reverence, but calculation, not trust, but comfort. Remove the blessing the adversary implied, and Job's worship would collapse. Take away the hedge around him. Touch what he has, and he will curse God. It is one of the most unsettling questions in the human heart. Do we love God for who He is, or only for what He gives? Would faith remain if the gifts were taken back? Would reverence survive when the visible evidence of blessing disappeared? Job knew none of this. He was not invited into the conversation. He did not hear the accusation. He did not receive a warning in the night. He did not wake with an explanation burning in his spirit. He simply lived another day. And that is how suffering often arrives, not with thunder in the distance, not with a voice telling us to prepare. Sometimes it comes into an ordinary morning, while life still feels familiar, while the people we love are somewhere else laughing, working, traveling, eating, unaware that the world is about to turn. The day began, and somewhere Job's sons and daughters were eating and drinking wine in their oldest brother's house. Perhaps Job imagined them there. Perhaps he knew the pattern so well that he could picture it without trying. The brothers gathered together, the sisters seated among them, the warmth of family, the sound of celebration, the security of a household untouched by dread. Then a messenger came to Job. He was not walking calmly. He was running. His clothes may have been torn by travel, his breathing broken by fear. The kind of news he carried could not wait. The oxen were plowing and the donkeys feeding beside them, he said, and the Sabaeans fell upon them and took them and struck down the servants with the edge of the sword, and I alone have escaped to tell you. In one moment, a portion of Job's wealth was gone, his oxen, his donkeys, his servants, taken by violence. Before Job could absorb the blow, before grief could even find its full shape, another messenger came. The fire of God fell from heaven and burned up the sheep and the servants and consumed them, and I alone have escaped to tell you. The sheep were gone, more servants were dead, and the words themselves must have pierced him. Fire from heaven, not merely enemies, not merely raiders, something that appeared to fall from above. Before the second wound could settle, a third messenger arrived. The Chaldeans formed 3 groups and made a raid on the camels and took them and struck down the servants with the edge of the sword, and I alone have escaped to tell you. The camels were gone. More servants were gone. In the ancient world, this was not just financial loss. This was the collapse of security, commerce, mobility, status, and livelihood. In a matter of moments, the visible structure of Job's life was being dismantled piece by piece. But the final messenger carried the news no father should ever hear. Your sons and daughters were eating and drinking wine in their oldest brother's house, and behold, a great wind came across the wilderness and struck the 4 corners of the house, and it fell upon the young people, and they are dead, and I alone have escaped to tell you. There are words that divide life into before and after. For Job, these were those words. The animals mattered. The servants mattered. The devastation was already unbearable. But his children, 7 sons, 3 daughters, the house where they had gathered became the place where their voices ended. No farewell, no final embrace, no time to run, no chance for a father to shield them. A wind from the wilderness struck the house, and the future Job had imagined was buried beneath its ruins. The silence after such news cannot be measured. There is a kind of grief so deep that the body moves before the mind understands. Job rose. He tore his robe. He shaved his head. These were signs of mourning, visible expressions of a heart shattered beyond language. Then he fell to the ground. But he did not fall as a man cursing. He fell in worship. Naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked shall I return. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. Those words have been repeated in sanctuaries, whispered beside graves, spoken through tears by people trying to hold on to faith when life makes no sense. But we must not make them sound easy. Job did not speak them from comfort. He spoke them while the ashes of his children's death were still settling. He spoke them before any restoration had come. He spoke them when he had lost almost everything a man could lose. This was not denial. This was not emotional numbness. This was worship bleeding through grief. Job did not understand, but he refused to reduce God to the size of his pain. His hands were empty now, but they had always been receiving hands. And in all this, Job did not sin or charge God with wrong. But the story was not over. The first wave had taken his possessions and his children. The second would touch his own flesh. Again, beyond what Job could see, the adversary accused him. A man may lose what is around him and still cling to God, he argued, but touch his bone and his flesh, and he will curse God to his face. So Job was struck with painful sores from the sole of his foot to the crown of his head. The man who had once sat in honor now sat among the ashes. The man who had once been greeted with respect now scraped his skin with a broken piece of pottery. The man whose presence once brought dignity now became an image of humiliation. His body, once strong enough to oversee a vast household, became a place of torment. His nights were restless. His days were heavy. Even sleep did not bring escape. Pain has a way of shrinking the world. A man who once thought about fields, children, servants, offerings, justice, and community now thinks about the next breath, the next wave of suffering, the next hour he must survive. Job sat in ashes, and the ashes became more than a place. They became a symbol of what his life had become. His wife, who had lost the same children, who had watched the same household collapse, who had seen the husband she loved reduced to agony, came to him with words shaped by despair. "Do you still hold fast your integrity? Curse God and die." It is easy to judge her harshly from a distance, but she too had buried the future. She too had felt the walls fall. She too had lost sons and daughters. Her words were not the words of cold unbelief, as much as they were the words of a soul crushed beneath grief. She saw no way forward. She saw only suffering stretching ahead. Perhaps death looked kinder than endurance. Perhaps bitterness seemed more honest than hope. But Job answered her, "You speak as one of the foolish women would speak. Shall we receive good from God, and shall we not receive evil?" Again, in all this, Job did not sin with his lips, but something in Job would begin to open. His worship was real, but so was his anguish. His faith endured, but his questions did not disappear. The story of Job is not the story of a man who never wept, never struggled, and never spoke from the depths of confusion. It is the story of a man who brought his agony into the presence of God and refused to pretend that pain was simple. When Job's 3 friends heard of all the evil that had come upon him, they came from their own places. Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar made an appointment together to come and show him sympathy and comfort him. At first, they did well. From a distance, they did not recognize him. That detail alone tells us how much suffering had changed Job. His face, his body, his posture, his presence, everything about him had been altered by grief and disease. The man they once knew was sitting before them, but he was almost unrecognizable. They raised their voices and wept. They tore their robes. They sprinkled dust on their heads toward heaven. Then they sat with him on the ground 7 days and 7 nights, and no one spoke a word to him, for they saw that his suffering was very great. There are moments when silence is the most faithful form of comfort. Before they tried to explain him, they sat with him. Before they tried to correct him, they wept. Before arguments filled the air, friendship looked like presence. For 7 days, the ash heap became a place of shared grief. But silence cannot hold forever when the human mind is desperate for answers. Eventually, Job opened his mouth. He cursed the day of his birth. He did not curse God, but he cursed the day his life began. He wished that the night he was conceived had never existed. He wondered why light is given to the one who suffers, why life continues for those whose souls are bitter. These were not polished words. They were not comfortable words. They came from a man standing at the edge of what a human heart can bear. Job wanted to know why he had been born if his life would come to this. His grief was not theoretical. It was not a discussion in a quiet room about suffering as an idea. It was the cry of a father without children, a man without health, a servant of God without explanation. And then his friends began to speak. Eliphaz spoke first, and his words carried the tone of wisdom, but not the tenderness Job needed. He suggested that the innocent do not perish, that those who plow iniquity reap trouble. He implied what people have often implied when they encounter suffering they cannot explain. Job's pain must have a cause in Job himself. Bildad followed with sharper words. He asked whether God perverts justice. He suggested that if Job's children had sinned, they had received the consequence of their rebellion. He urged Job to seek God, implying that restoration would come if Job were truly pure and upright. Then Zophar spoke, more severe than the others. He accused Job of empty talk and insisted that God was giving him less than his guilt deserved. What began as comfort became accusation. What began as presence became pressure. Job was not only suffering his losses, he was now suffering the interpretations of those around him. His friends believed they were defending God, but they were wounding a broken man. They believed they were preserving justice, but they were flattening mystery into a formula. To them, suffering had to mean guilt. Loss had to mean punishment. Pain had to mean hidden sin. But Job knew his life. He did not claim the kind of perfection that belongs only to God, but he knew that this destruction was not the result of secret rebellion. He searched his memory and found no crime equal to his suffering. He looked at his ashes and could not find the sin that matched them. So he spoke. He answered. He questioned. He wrestled. He longed for someone to stand between him and God, someone who could lay a hand on both. He wished his words were written down, engraved forever. He cried out that he knew his Redeemer lived, and that in the end, after his skin had been destroyed, he would yet see God. There were flashes of astonishing hope in Job's darkness, but they did not erase the darkness. They shone inside it. That is what makes his faith so human. It was not a faith that spoke only in victory. It was a faith that trembled, argued, grieved, and still kept reaching toward God. Job did not abandon God. He brought his pain to God. There is a difference. Many people think faith means never asking hard questions. But Job's story shows something more profound. Faith can be wounded and still real. Faith can be confused and still alive. Faith can sit in ashes and still refuse to let go. And perhaps, while you listen to this story, there is a question inside your own life that has never received a simple answer. Maybe there was a season when you prayed and nothing seemed to move. Maybe there was a loss no one around you could explain. Maybe someone tried to give you quick answers when what you needed was presence. If that is true, hold that question close as we continue, because Job's story does not rush toward an easy answer. It lets the silence be heavy. It lets the grief speak. And only then does it lead us toward the voice that comes from the whirlwind. As the conversations continued, Job's friends became more certain, and Job became more isolated. Eliphaz spoke from visions and tradition. Bildad reached for the wisdom of the past. Zophar leaned into judgment, but none of them could see the full wound before them. They spoke about God, but they did not speak rightly about Job. They had theology, but they lacked compassion. They had explanations, but they lacked understanding. And this is one of the quiet warnings in the story. When we see someone suffering, we should be careful not to speak as though we have seen the whole counsel of heaven. We should be careful not to turn pain into a courtroom where the wounded must defend themselves. Sometimes the holiest thing we can do is sit near the ashes without pretending we know why they are there. Job's replies grew stronger. He remembered who he had been before calamity came. He remembered the days when he walked in honor, when young men stepped aside, when elders rose, when people listened to his counsel. He had delivered the poor who cried for help. He had been eyes to the blind and feet to the lame. He had broken the power of the unrighteous and protected those who had no defender. Job had not used power to crush the weak. He had used it to protect them, and now he was mocked. Those who once would not have been counted among the lowest of his servants looked at him with contempt. His dignity had been stripped away. His body was failing. His harp had turned to mourning. Loss rarely comes in only one layer. Job lost possessions, but also status. He lost children, but also the future attached to them. He lost health, but also the dignity of being seen as whole. He lost friends, not because they left physically, but because they stopped seeing him clearly. He lost the comfort of answers. And still, beneath all of it, he wanted God, not merely relief, not merely prosperity, not merely vindication before people. He wanted an audience with the Almighty. He wanted to know why. He wanted to bring his case before God, not because he believed he was greater than God, but because he could not reconcile the God he trusted with the suffering he endured. The question at the center of Job is not simple rebellion. It is wounded trust. It is the cry of someone who believes God is just and cannot understand why justice feels hidden. Then another voice entered the conversation. Elihu, younger than the others, had waited while the older men spoke. He burned with anger both at Job for justifying himself rather than God, and at the friends because they had found no answer though they had declared Job wrong. Elihu spoke at length about God's greatness, his justice, his discipline, his power in creation, his voice in storms, and the limits of human understanding. His words prepared the air for something greater, because after all the human speeches, after all the arguments, after all the accusations, after all the cries of Job, the Lord answered, not from a quiet chamber, not through a soft whisper in a still room. The Lord answered Job out of the whirlwind. Imagine that moment. The ash heap, the broken man, the friends who had spoken so much, the questions that had risen like smoke. And then the sky itself seems to gather into voice. The whirlwind arrives, and with it, the presence of God. But God does not begin by explaining the heavenly counsel. He does not reveal to Job the conversation that started the trial. He does not walk Job through the hidden architecture of suffering. He does not say, "Here is why every wound was permitted. Here is how every loss fits into the design." Instead, God asks Job questions. Where were you when I laid the foundation of the earth? The question is not cruelty. It is revelation. God takes Job beyond the ashes, beyond the narrow place of his pain, beyond the court of human accusation, and sets before him the vastness of creation. Who determined the measurements of the earth? Who stretched the line upon it? On what were its bases sunk? Who laid its cornerstone when the morning stars sang together and all the sons of God shouted for joy? God speaks of the sea, bursting from the womb, clothed with clouds, bounded by divine command. He speaks of morning and darkness. He speaks of the storehouses of snow. He speaks of the paths of lightning. He speaks of rain falling on land where no man is. He speaks of the constellations in their seasons. He speaks of lions and ravens, mountain goats and wild donkeys, the wild ox, the ostrich, the horse clothed with might, the hawk soaring by wisdom, the eagle making its nest on high. Creation unfolds before Job like a living scroll. Every creature, every storm, every star, every hidden place of the wilderness declares that the world is larger, deeper, and more mysterious than Job can grasp. This answer may feel strange to us because we often want explanation more than encounter. We want God to tell us why the house fell, why the sickness came, why the prayers seemed unanswered, why the righteous suffered, why the wicked appeared to prosper. But God gives Job something more overwhelming than explanation. He gives him himself. He reveals that divine wisdom is not absent simply because human understanding is limited. He shows Job that the universe is not governed by chaos, even when Job's life feels chaotic. He lifts Job's eyes from the ash heap to the foundations of the world. This does not make Job's pain imaginary. God does not say the losses were small. God does not dismiss the graves. God does not pretend the sores did not burn. But he places Job's suffering inside a reality too vast for Job to command and too wise for Job to fully measure. Then the Lord speaks of creatures beyond human control, of Behemoth and Leviathan, images of power untamed by man. The message presses deeper. There are forces in creation Job cannot master, realities he cannot subdue, mysteries he cannot domesticate. If Job cannot govern these, how can he govern the moral universe? How can he demand that all things fit within the reach of his present sight? Job had wanted to question God. Now, standing before the living God he sees differently, he answers, "Behold, I am of small account. What shall I answer you? I lay my hand on my mouth." But God continues, and when the Lord has finished speaking, Job responds with words that have carried the weight of humility for centuries. "I know that you can do all things, and that no purpose of yours can be thwarted." Job admits he spoke of things too wonderful for him, things he did not know. He says, "I had heard of you by the hearing of the ear, but now my eye sees you." This is the turning point of Job's soul. His circumstances have not yet changed. His children are still gone. His body has not yet been described as healed. His wealth has not yet returned. But Job has encountered God. And that encounter changes the way he stands inside his unanswered questions. He does not receive the explanation we might expect. He receives the presence that makes trust possible when explanation is withheld. This is not a small lesson. It is not easy. It is not something to speak lightly to someone in pain. But it is the heart of the story. Faith is not proven only when life is full. Faith is revealed when everything visible is gone, and the soul must decide whether God is still God in the ashes. After the Lord speaks to Job, he turns to Job's friends. And the verdict is startling. God's anger burns against Eliphaz and his two friends because they had not spoken of him what was right, as Job had. The men who thought they were defending God are corrected by God. The man they accused is vindicated. They must bring offerings, and Job, the wounded man, must pray for them. The one they misjudged becomes the one through whom mercy comes to them. There is something deeply powerful in this. Job's restoration begins not with revenge, but with intercession. He could have looked at his friends and remembered every accusation. He could have held their words like stones. He could have said, "Now you see. Now God has shown who was right." But Job prayed for them. Suffering had not made him small. Pain had not destroyed his capacity for mercy. The man who had lost everything still had a heart able to stand before God on behalf of those who had wounded him. And then the Lord restored the fortunes of Job. The Scripture says that the Lord gave Job twice as much as he had before. His brothers, sisters, and all who had known him before came to him. They ate bread with him in his house. They showed him sympathy and comforted him for all the evil that the Lord had allowed to come upon him. Each gave him money and a ring of gold. The life that had collapsed began slowly and visibly to rise again. The fields that had emptied would fill. The herds that had vanished would return in abundance. The name that had been associated with calamity would be spoken again with honor. Job had 14,000 sheep, 6,000 camels, 1,000 yoke of oxen, and 1,000 female donkeys. But the restoration that touches the heart most deeply is not counted only in animals or wealth. Job also had 7 sons and 3 daughters. The daughters are named Jemimah, Keziah, and Keren-Happuch. In all the land there were no women so beautiful as Job's daughters, and their father gave them an inheritance among their brothers. This detail is tender and unusual. It shows Job not only restored in possessions, but enlarged in heart. He honors his daughters with inheritance, giving them a place of dignity and value in a world where such actions were not common. After this, Job lived 140 years and saw his sons and his sons' sons 4 generations, and Job died, an old man and full of days. But we must be careful with the ending. The restoration is real, but it does not erase the grief that came before it. New children are a blessing, but they do not make the first children meaningless. Returned wealth is mercy, but it does not make the ashes unreal. A long life is grace, but it does not mean Job never remembered the day the messengers came running. Biblical restoration is not the denial of suffering. It is the testimony that suffering does not have the final word. Job's story does not tell us that if we suffer faithfully, everything will quickly return in the way we want. It does not give us a simple formula. It gives us something deeper, harder, and more enduring. It tells us that God is not absent from the questions we cannot answer. It tells us that righteousness does not exempt a person from pain. It tells us that friends can be sincere and still be wrong. It tells us that grief can speak honestly without faith being destroyed. It tells us that the silence of God is not the same as the absence of God. And it tells us that there is a kind of faith that cannot be explained by comfort, success, or visible blessing. That was the accusation against Job from the beginning. Does Job fear God for nothing? In the end, Job's life answers. He worshiped when he lost. He endured when he did not understand. He questioned, but he did not walk away. He grieved, but he kept speaking to God. He sat in ashes, but he did not surrender his soul to bitterness. This does not make Job superhuman. It makes his story more powerful because we see him tremble. We hear him lament. We watch him struggle beneath the weight of pain. He is not made of stone. He is a man with a broken heart. And yet, somewhere in that broken heart, faith remains, not polished, not easy, not untouched by sorrow, but alive. There are people who meet God in blessing. Job met him in the whirlwind. There are people who learn theology in comfort. Job learned the limits of human understanding while sitting in ashes. There are people whose faith is admired because they prosper. Job's faith was revealed because he suffered and still would not let go of God. This is why his story continues to speak, because every generation eventually faces the ash heap in some form. A diagnosis, a funeral, a betrayal, a collapse, a silence that seems to stretch too long, a life that looks nothing like what was hoped for. And when that moment comes, the question is not whether we will understand everything. We will not. The question is whether trust can survive mystery. Job teaches us that faith is not the absence of questions. Faith is the refusal to let suffering become the only voice we hear. It is the courage to say, I do not understand, without turning that into, God is not there. It is the humility to admit that the world is wider than our wound, even while our wound is real. It is the strength to worship through tears, not because pain is good, but because God is still worthy. Near the end of Job's story, we are not left with a neat explanation. We are left with a man who has seen God more deeply than before. A man whose life was restored, but whose soul had also been enlarged by the mystery he endured. He began as the greatest man in the East. He ended as something greater than wealthy. He ended as a witness that faith can pass through fire, a witness that God's wisdom exceeds the reach of human sight, a witness that the righteous may suffer, but suffering does not erase righteousness, a witness that the ashes are not beyond the voice of God. And perhaps, as we listen to Job's story, we are invited to examine our own faith with honesty. Would we love God if the gifts were removed? Would we still seek Him when His ways are hidden? Would we sit in the silence and keep our hearts open to the one who answers, not always with explanations, but with presence? These are not easy questions. They are not meant to be. They are the questions that form the soul in deep places. If this story has spoken to something in your own life, carry it with you for a moment. You can share your thoughts in the comments or simply leave the name Job as a quiet reminder that even in the ashes, faith can still breathe. And if you want to continue walking through these biblical stories with a cinematic and reflective heart, you are welcome to stay with this channel for the next journey. The story of Job begins with a man who had everything. It passes through a day when everything was taken. It descends into grief, sickness, accusation, silence, and questions that seem to have no answer. But it does not end in the ashes. It ends with the God who speaks from the whirlwind, the God who sees what man cannot see, the God who corrects false comforters, the God who restores what is broken, though never cheaply, never as if the pain did not matter. And the man who lost everything overnight becomes the man whose suffering still teaches the world how to endure, not by pretending pain is small, not by hiding grief beneath religious words, not by having every answer, but by holding on to God when all other things have slipped from His hands. The Lord gave, the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord.